July of the year 1518 descended upon Strasbourg like a scorching blanket, turning the medieval streets into a labyrinth of stifling stone corridors where every breath burned the lungs. The air shimmered over the cobblestones, distorting the outlines of the half-timbered houses, and the smell of filth, sweat, and rotting waste hung like a heavy veil that made eyes water. In this hell, where even rats sought shade, she appeared, a woman whose name would later be mentioned only in half-forgotten chronicles as the beginning of the end. Frau Trophia stepped out of her house not like an ordinary townsman, but as a conduit for something ancient and incomprehensible. Her body began to move to a rhythm that did not exist in the world of the living, her feet beating time on the scorching stones with mechanical persistence, while her hands flailed in the air as if driving away invisible demons. Her face expressed not pain, but something worse, the realization that she no longer controlled her own body. Eyes, wide open and immobile, looked through the crowd, fixing on what was hidden from other mortals. She could not stop. She could not rest. She could not even slow this mad dance, which took her strength with every minute, but not the will to move. Passers-by froze, watching this spectacle, and whispered prayers, crossed themselves, retreated into the shadows of the houses, fearing that the strange illness might jump onto them like a spark from a fire. Neighbors tried to help, grabbed her hands, begged her to stop, but her muscles were stretched by invisible threads, and her joints seemed lubricated with oil that did not allow them to freeze at rest. By evening her feet turned into a bloody mess, shoes crumbled into dust, and red marks remained on the ancient cobblestones, washed away only by night dew. But even pain, sharp and piercing, could not make her stop. At night, when Strasbourg plunged into darkness, illuminated only by flickering lanterns and the pale light of the moon, the solitary figure of the woman continued her relentless dance. Her movements became more spasmodic, less coordinated, but no less persistent. Residents of nearby houses could not sleep, listening to this strange rhythm of steps on stone, which sounded like an ominous omen, like a countdown to something inevitable. By morning of the next day, Frau Trophia was on the verge of complete exhaustion, her breathing became intermittent, her skin acquired a grayish tint, but her legs still moved, driven by some unknown force that did not allow her to drop dead. And then happened that which turned a personal tragedy into an urban catastrophe. After a few days, the first follower joined her, a middle-aged man whose face was distorted by the same grimace of silent supplication. Then another. And another. Like an invisible infection, the strange disease began to spread through the city, capturing new victims with frightening speed. Their bodies began to move to the same mad rhythm, and they could not resist this strange urge, just as they could not stop the tide or the sunrise. The city square, once a place of trade and communication, turned into a giant stage for agony, where dozens, and then hundreds of people collided in convulsions, emitting sounds of breaking bones and ragged breathing. The smell of sweat mixed with the aroma of pus and filth, creating a nauseating aura that made observers dizzy and caught their breath. People fell directly onto the pavement, their hearts bursting from excessive tension, but the rest continued to whirl, driven by some inner force that did not allow them to drop dead. No one understood what was happening. No one could explain why healthy people suddenly lost control over their own bodies. No one dared to suggest that the answer might be much simpler and much scarier than any demonic theories. Strasbourg stood on the threshold of something unknown, and the first notes of that deadly symphony were already sounding in the rhythm of feet striking the stone. 1 week later, the lonely silhouette of the woman, thrashing alone on the scorching pavement, turned into a procession of 34 people, and after another month, their number was already counted in hundreds. What had begun as a strange incident with one resident had grown into an urban catastrophe of unprecedented scale, seizing Strasbourg in its cruel embrace. The city square, once serving as a place for trade, holidays, and public gatherings, became a giant stage for agony, where bodies collided in convulsions, emitting sounds of breaking bones and ragged breathing that froze the blood in the veins of even the most steadfast observers. The air above the square became dense and viscous, soaked with the smell of sweat that mixed with the aroma of pus and filth, creating a nauseating aura that made observers dizzy and caught their breath. It seemed that the air itself refused to accept this smell of death, but it had nowhere to go. It stagnated between the high walls of the houses, pressing on the residents with a heavy burden of inevitability. People fell directly onto the cobblestones, their hearts bursting from excessive tension, but the rest continued to whirl, driven by some inner force that did not allow them to drop dead. This was not just movement, it was a violent action committed against the will of the flesh. Muscles strained to the limit, tendons stretched like strings, ready to burst from the slightest extra effort. The skin on the dancer's legs was rubbed to the meat, exposing red muscle fibers that pulsed to the rhythm of this mad dance. Blood left marks on the gray cobblestones, creating bizarre patterns that were washed away only by rare night rains, but by morning fresh red spots appeared again. Shoes could not withstand even a few hours of such treatment, soles peeled off, straps burst, and soon most of the dancers moved barefoot, not feeling the pain from the sharp edges of the stones, because pain was now the constant background of their existence, the only sign that they were still alive. The sound that this crowd made was impossible to forget for anyone who heard it even once. It was not the rhythmic tap of dance steps, but a dull, wet slap of flesh on stone, interspersed with the dry crack of breaking bones. When someone fell, their limbs bent at unnatural angles, but the body continued to twitch even on the ground, like a doll whose mechanism was broken but the spring was not stopped. The ragged breathing of hundreds of people merged into a single hum, similar to the noise of the surf, but instead of salt, there was copper of blood and acid of fear in this air. Mothers lost children, husbands lost wives, and no one could help, because touching a dancer sometimes caused a strange tingling sensation in their own limbs, as if the disease could be transmitted through the skin. Relatives stood at the edge of the square, clenching their hands into fists, biting their lips until they bled, watching as their loved ones turned into mechanisms devoid of soul, reason, and mercy of fate. The heat did not subside. The sun of the year 1518 seemed especially cruel this year, as if the sky itself decided to punish the city for unknown sins. The shadows from the houses were short and black, they did not give coolness, only emphasized the blinding light that beat into the eyes, making them squint and water. In this light, the faces of the dancers looked like masks of suffering, covered with a layer of dirt and dried blood. Some eyes were closed, others looked at the sky, begging for mercy that no one could grant. Some fell into a trance, their faces relaxed in a strange smile, which was even scarier than grimaces of pain, because this smile said that the mind had already left these bodies, leaving only a shell to perform someone else's will. Old women crossed themselves, standing in the doorways of their houses, whispering prayers to patron saints, but church bells rang rarely, as if the priests were also afraid to go out into the square and face this evil face to face. Rumors spread faster than the disease itself. They said it was the curse of Saint Vitus, who demanded redemption through movement. Others whispered that someone had cast a hex, throwing enchanted dust into the wells. Others claimed it was the end of the world, a sign of the apocalypse predicted in ancient books. But none of these theories could stop the dance. City authorities tried to isolate the square, posting guards, but the guards themselves began to feel weakness in their legs, standing next to the fence, and they had to be urgently replaced. Merchants closed their stalls, the market emptied, life in the city froze, focusing around this epicenter of madness. Even the rats, usually teeming in the sewers of Strasbourg, seemed to feel the danger and disappeared, leaving people alone with their trouble. Death began to claim its first victims one by one, leaving stiff bodies in strange poses on the cobblestones. First, the oldest and weakest died, their hearts could not withstand the load, stopping right during the next step. Their bodies fell heavily, like bags of stones, and for some time still twitched in agony before freezing forever. But the death of one did not stop the others. On the contrary, it seemed that the energy of the dead passed to the living, forcing them to move even faster, even more fiercely, as if they were trying to run away from death that was on their heels. Young men, strong and healthy just a week ago, now staggered from exhaustion, their faces covered with deep wrinkles, hair turned gray in a few days. They tried to cling to each other, forming circles so as not to fall, but these circles constantly broke when someone lost consciousness and dragged neighbors down with them. Doctors invited by the council walked among the dancers, felt the pulse, looked into the eyes, but their faces became more and more confused. They could not find a physical cause that would explain such stability of the organism to pain and fatigue. The pulse was rapid, pressure was off the charts, body temperature rose to critical levels, but people did not die from the heat, they continued to move, as if their metabolism worked on some other fuel, unavailable to the understanding of science of that time. Some doctors suggested it was mass poisoning, and tried to give the dancers herbs that caused vomiting, but it did not help. Others attempted bloodletting, hoping to release the bad blood, but the blood was dark and thick, and after the procedure the dance only intensified. Every method of treatment turned out to be useless, and this helplessness of medicine sowed even greater fear among the population. If scientists cannot help, then the cause lies beyond human understanding. At night the square did not empty. Torches installed around the perimeter illuminated this gruesome performance, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of houses. It seemed that the shadows were also dancing, separating from their owners and living their own lives. The sound of footsteps did not subside for a minute, creating a hypnotic rhythm that penetrated into homes, forcing residents to wake up in a cold sweat. Children cried in their sleep, seeing nightmares about people who had no faces, only continuous movement. Adults sat at the windows, unable to close their eyes, listening to how the rhythm changed. Sometimes it accelerated, becoming frantic, and then a new fall happened in the crowd, a new crunch of bone, a new scream that quickly cut off. Sometimes it slowed down, becoming heavy and viscous, like movement in a swamp, and then it seemed that the dance was about to stop, but this was a deceptive calm before a new wave of madness. The city was turning into a giant grave under the sounds of breaking bones, and the church was silent. This silence was the most terrible accusation. Priests, who should have been comforting, explaining, seeking the cause in sins and offering repentance, preferred to lock themselves in their temples. Church doors were locked, candles did not burn, prayers were not sounded. As if faith itself retreated before this physical manifestation of suffering. People felt abandoned not only by the authorities but also by God. They looked for answers in the stars, in the arrangement of planets, in ancient prophecies, but the answers did not come. Only the dance remained, only pain, only endless movement towards death. And in this chaos, an understanding was born that what was happening in the square might never end, that this rhythm could become a new law of being, replacing peace and sleep. Strasbourg was suffocating, and every breath seemed like the last, but the dancers could not even take this breath fully, their ribcages worked superficially, barely supplying oxygen to exhausted muscles. They were machines for dancing, and fuel in these machines was running out, but stopping was forbidden by some invisible command written in the very structure of their nervous system. And while the city watched, holding its breath, the number of dancers continued to grow, approaching the critical mark behind which begins the point of no return. The City Council of Strasbourg convened an emergency meeting at the moment when despair had already begun to eat away at the walls of the town hall from the inside. The magistrates, respected citizens, and councillors sat in a spacious hall illuminated by the flickering light of wax candles, trying to find a rational explanation for what was happening outside the windows. The atmosphere was tense to the breaking point, voices sounded sharp and nervous, hands trembled not from old age but from fear of the unknown that was approaching the city with heavy steps. Reports lay on the table, stained with ink and perhaps something else, something darker. Every document was a testament to helplessness, every protocol an admission that traditional methods of governance no longer worked. In the air hung the smell of wax, old parchment, and human fear, which penetrated even through the thick stone walls. The invited city physicians, the most educated people of their time, stood before the council and presented their theory. They spoke of hot blood, of an excess of vital fluids that required release, of an imbalance of humors that led to the fury of the flesh. Their words sounded convincing, clothed in Latin and backed by references to ancient authors, but in the eyes of some councillors doubt could be read. The doctors declared that the cause of the strange ailment lay in overheated blood that boiled in the veins of the dancers, forcing their bodies to move against their will. According to the medical theory of that time, The only way to heal could be continuing the dance until complete exhaustion of the body, when it would naturally cleanse itself of harmful substances, flushing them out together with sweat and movement. This decision, which seemed logical from the standpoint of medieval science, proved to be a fatal mistake that turned treatment into an organized execution. The council made a decision, and the city began to change. On the main square, where the epidemic of madness had been raging for months, wooden platforms appeared, built hastily but sturdily, so that the dancers would not damage their feet on the sharp edges of the cobblestones. Carpenters worked day and night, their hammers striking in unison with the rhythm of the dancers, creating a strange symphony of construction and suffering. The wood smelled of fresh resin, but this smell was quickly overpowered by what already hung over the square, the smell of blood, sweat, and despair. The platforms towered over the crowd like a scaffold, like a stage for a tragedy that no one wanted to watch but from which it was impossible to look away. Musicians were hired by order of the council. Professional drummers, flutists, violinists, people whose lives had always been associated with holidays and joy, now had to accompany agony. They were paid generously, too generously, and in their eyes could be read the understanding that they were becoming accomplices in something dark. The drums were tuned, the flutes checked, the strings tightened, and when the first notes sounded over the square, the dancers reacted instantly. Their movements became more rhythmic, more coordinated, but no less terrifying for it. The music did not alleviate their suffering, it intensified it, setting a tempo that was impossible to endure. The rhythm of the drums penetrated the hearts of the observers, making their own blood beat faster and their hands clench involuntarily into fists. This decision turned treatment into execution, forcing weakened people to move even faster until their faces turned blue from lack of oxygen. Those who could still stand were now forced to obey an external rhythm that did not allow them to slow down, to rest, to take a deep breath. The musicians played without interruption, their fingers went numb from tension, lips cracked from dryness, but they could not stop because behind their backs stood guards with spears, reminding them of the council's order. The sound filled every corner of the square, reflected off the walls of houses, penetrated windows, pursuing residents even in their own bedrooms. This was not music in the usual understanding, it was an acoustic whip that drove the dancers forward, to the edge of the abyss. Observers, who before had simply watched, now felt like accomplices. They saw how the musicians, unwillingly themselves, became instruments of death. They heard how the drums measured not beats but seconds of life that leaked through fingers together with sweat and blood. Some turned away, closed windows, plugged their ears, but the sound found paths, penetrated through cracks, through walls, through consciousness. Children cried, not understanding why adults had suddenly become so pale, why mothers stopped singing lullabies, why fathers did not return from the square, and if they did return, it was with an empty gaze and trembling hands. The doctors observed the result of their advice with mixed feelings. On one hand, the dancers indeed moved more rhythmically, their movements became less chaotic, which could be interpreted as improvement. On the other hand, the number of deaths did not decrease but on the contrary grew with frightening speed. Hearts could not withstand, lungs failed, muscles tore from overexertion, but the music continued to play, the drums continued to beat, and the council continued to insist on continuing the course of treatment. This was no longer medical intervention, this was a dogma in which those who made decisions believed, despite all evidence to the contrary. On the platforms dancers fell and rose, their bodies were covered with ulcers and wounds, legs swollen beyond recognition, many suffered from hallucinations and delirium. But the music continued to play, the drums beat their relentless rhythm, and the overseers did not allow anyone to stop. Some dancers tried to resist, their faces distorted in a silent scream, hands reached out to the musicians, begging for mercy, but pleas drowned in the thunder of drums. The music drowned out everything, moans, crying, prayers, the last words of the dying. It became a wall behind which the truth about what was really happening was hidden. City chronicles of that time describe scenes that are difficult to imagine even for the richest imagination. People dancing until their bones began to break under their own weight. Mothers who could not stop to feed their children, and children who cried, reaching hands to mothers but could not reach them. Craftsmen dropping their tools and joining the mad circle right in the middle of work, because the rhythm penetrated their consciousness and did not let go. The entire city plunged into an atmosphere of fear and hopelessness, where the only sound was music, and the only movement was dance. The council continued to meet, making new decisions that only worsened the situation. They did not see, or did not want to see, that their methods were not working. They clung to the theory about hot blood like a drowning man to a straw, because admitting a mistake would mean admitting their responsibility for hundreds of deaths. It was much easier to continue insisting on the correctness of the chosen course than to revise the foundations of their own worldview. And the music continued to play, and the dancers continued to move, and death continued to gather its harvest, and the council continued to believe that a little more, just a little bit, and everything would end, and the city would return to normal life. But normal life was already unattainable. The square turned into a place where people were afraid even to look, let alone approach. Trade froze, crafts stopped, children did not play in the streets because the streets belonged to the dancers and the music. Strasbourg, once a prosperous imperial city, became a hostage of its own decision, which was supposed to save but only accelerated the catastrophe. And in the silence between the drum beats, in the pauses between the notes of the flute, one could hear something else, a quiet, almost inaudible sound that was more terrifying than any music. It was the sound of breaking fates, the sound of fading hopes, the sound of a city that danced on the edge of the abyss, not knowing that the fall had already begun. August of the year 1518 became the month when death ceased to be an event and turned into routine. It began claiming its victims one by one, methodically, without hurry, as if it knew that time was working in its favor. Bodies fell directly onto the wooden platforms, onto the scorching cobblestones, into the dirt and dust of the square, freezing in strange, unnatural poses that could not be replicated even in the most sophisticated nightmare. Hands stretched out in supplication, legs curled in final spasms, heads thrown back with open mouths frozen in silent screams. Rigor mortis set in quickly, too quickly, and bodies remained lying where death had caught them, because no one dared to approach, no one wanted to touch those who danced with the devil. The smell of decomposition began to mix with the smell of sweat and pus, creating a new, even more nauseating aura that made observers dizzy and brought nausea even to the most steadfast. Flies swarmed in clouds over the square, black, shiny, persistent, and their buzzing became another sound in this symphony of horror, another reminder that life was departing and decay was taking its place. The church remained silent. This silence was louder than any sermon, more eloquent than any prayer, more terrifying than any curse. In an era when every unusual phenomenon immediately received religious interpretation, when a comet was considered a harbinger of doom and an eclipse a sign of God's wrath, the strange illness that had struck hundreds of people provoked no official response from the clergy. The archbishop gave no sermons, priests conducted no mass prayers, organized no processions to cast out evil spirits. Church doors remained closed, bells did not ring, candles did not burn before altars. As if faith itself had retreated before this physical manifestation of suffering, as if God had turned away from Strasbourg, leaving it alone with its punishment. Priests, who should have been comforting, explaining, seeking the cause in sins and offering repentance, preferred to lock themselves in their churches, whisper in vestries, avoid the gazes of parishioners. Some of them, those who dared to venture onto the square, saw a clear punishment in this phenomenon for the sins of the city, for moral decay, for deviation from the true faith. They whispered prayers, crossed themselves, retreated into shadows, but made no attempt to perform exorcism rites, made no effort to cast out the demons that, in their opinion, had possessed the dancers. Why? What held them back from action? Fear? Doubt? Or knowledge of something that could not be spoken aloud? At the same time, owners of grain warehouses and bread merchants behaved with suspicious calm. They did not go out to the square, did not join crowds of observers, did not whisper about God's punishment. They sat in their offices, counted coins, checked warehouse books, conducted quiet negotiations with suppliers. They knew what they were hiding from others. In this season, the rye stored in their granaries was affected by ergot. This parasitic fungus, developing in the humid conditions of damp cellars and poorly ventilated warehouses, produced powerful alkaloids that, when ingested, caused convulsions, hallucinations, uncontrollable muscle spasms, and the very madness that now gripped the city. The symptoms of ergotism, as this poisoning was called by physicians who knew of it only by hearsay, exactly matched what was happening in the square. Grain affected by ergot had a dark, almost black color and a strange, musty smell, but in times of hunger, people did not pay attention to this. Flour from such grain was slightly darker than usual, bread slightly heavier, but hunger does not distinguish shades. The poorest segments of the population, who fed mainly on bread, suffered the most, while wealthy citizens who had access to diverse food, meat, fish, fresh vegetables, remained healthy. This was not coincidence. This was pattern, which someone preferred not to notice. None of the officials dared to speak the truth about the cause of the epidemic aloud. Admitting that city authorities had allowed the sale of poisoned grain would mean loss of public trust, legal proceedings, confiscation of property, possible removal from office, and even execution for negligence leading to mass death. It was much easier to blame everything on God's will, devil's tricks, or planetary influence. Much more profitable to remain silent than to speak. Much safer to observe than to act. Warehouse owners continued selling grain, knowing it was poisoned. Bakers continued baking bread, knowing the flour was impure. Merchants continued delivering loaves to homes, knowing that each crust could be someone's last bite. This was not merely inaction. This was complicity. This was silent consent to the idea that the lives of the poor were worth less than profit from grain sales. Meanwhile, on the square, death continued its work. Bodies of the dead were piled in a corner, away from the dancers, but space ran out, and soon the dead lay intermingled with the living, and dancers, driven by invisible force, stepped on the bodies of their fellow sufferers, not noticing them, feeling nothing underfoot but rhythm. Some witnesses later swore they saw the bodies of the dead continuing to move for some time, twitching, as if the force that controlled them in life did not immediately leave the flesh after death. This was especially gruesome, watching a stiffened hand suddenly clench into a fist, a leg make one last useless movement, a head turn though eyes had already rolled back. The sound of breaking bones became so familiar that it ceased to shock, became background, white noise against which the tragedy unfolded. People stopped crying, stopped praying, stopped hoping. They simply watched, holding their breath, waiting for when it would end, not understanding that the end might never come. The church continued its silence, and this silence grew more eloquent with each passing hour. Some priests, those who could not endure, began whispering during confession that they saw punishment in this for greed, for indifference, for willingness to close eyes to the suffering of neighbors for personal gain. But these whispers drowned in the thunder of drums, in the stamp of feet on stone, in the ragged breathing of dancers. They did not reach the ears of those who could change something. They remained merely the quiet groan of conscience that no one wanted to hear. Owners of grain warehouses continued observing, calculating profits, assessing losses, planning next shipments. For them, this was not tragedy but an economic problem to be solved with minimal losses. They did not see the faces of dancers, did not hear their moans, did not smell death. They saw only numbers in books, and these numbers mattered more than any human lives. The truth that bread eaten by the poor was poisoned by mold flourishing in damp warehouses hung in the air, heavy as lead, but no one dared speak it aloud. Words have power, especially in times when faith in the word has not yet been undermined by cynicism. To speak the truth would mean triggering a chain reaction that could not be stopped. Accusations, trials, executions, riots, blood in the streets. It was much easier to let death claim its victims one by one than to risk everything to save those already doomed. And death claimed them. Day by day. Hour by hour. Minute by minute. And no one stopped it, because stopping would mean admitting guilt, and admitting guilt was more terrifying than any death. Strasbourg suffocated in silence, in quiet, in fear, and every breath seemed like the last, but dancers could not even take that breath fully, their ribcages working superficially, barely supplying oxygen to exhausted muscles. They were machines for dancing, and fuel in these machines was running out, but stopping was forbidden by some invisible command written in the very structure of their nervous systems, in the very fabric of reality, in the very heart of human cowardice. And while the city watched, holding its breath, the truth continued to remain silent, buried under layers of lies, indifference, and fear, waiting for the moment when someone would dare to speak it aloud. But that moment never came. The climax of madness arrived unnoticed, like the final drop that overflowed the cup of the city's patience, when the number of dancers reached 400 people. This was an army of sufferers, marching not by command of a general but by the will of an invisible conductor standing beyond the edge of human understanding. Strasbourg turned into a huge open-air hospital where every street corner, every courtyard, and every square became wards for the dying. The air became so heavy with the smell of death and decomposition that even the most steadfast observers could not endure it and left, pinching their noses with handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or rose water, but even these strong scents could not overpower the sweetish taste of rot that had settled on the tongue of every resident. Birds stopped flying over the city, dogs ran away into the fields, and it seemed that nature itself had turned away from this place, leaving people alone with their curse. In this hell where reality mixed with nightmare, the city authorities made a final desperate decision, hoping that a holy place could stop what neither doctors, nor musicians, nor prison walls had managed to halt. In a desperate attempt to stop the epidemic, it was decided to send the surviving dancers to the chapel of Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers and epileptics, located outside the city walls. It was believed that prayer in this holy place could cast out evil spirits, calm the heated blood, and heal the possessed through heavenly grace. A procession of exhausted people, supported by guards, slowly moved through the city streets, leaving a bloody trail behind them that dried in the sun as dark spots, like a seal of shame on the stones of the pavement. They were dragged, almost carried, because the legs of many no longer obeyed, bones were broken, and muscles had turned into a shapeless mass, but the body still twitched to a rhythm that sounded only in their heads. Crowds of residents stood along the route, silently watching this cross procession to nowhere. There were no prayers, no crying, only the dull thud of hundreds of feet and heavy breathing that sounded like the noise of the sea before a storm. Some covered their faces with their hands, others watched with empty expressions, as if understanding that this was not a path to salvation but a final road to the grave. They hoped that the word of God could tame the flesh, that faith could overcome physics, but reality turned out to be cruel. Some truly came to their senses after long prayers and repentance, their bodies ceased moving to the mad rhythm, they fell to their knees and wept, realizing the horror of what they had done and what had happened to them. But most died right during the service, their bodies continuing to convulse even after the soul had left the flesh. This was the most gruesome spectacle that the walls of the chapel had ever seen. Bodies lay on the cold stone floor, eyes rolled back, foam came from their mouths, but hands and feet continued to twitch, beating the last bar of non-existent music. Priests conducting the rites were horrified by what they saw, and many of them subsequently refused to serve masses in this chapel, considering the place desecrated not by sin but by death itself, which did not want to acknowledge sacred ground. The sound of dying bodies beating against the stone floor drowned out the prayers. Candles crackled, the flames swayed from the air movement created by the convulsions of hundreds of people. It seemed that the chapel itself breathed in unison with them, that the walls were compressing, trying to squeeze life out of this place. Priests tried to lay hands on the heads of the dying, read exorcisms in a whisper, but words stuck in their throats. They saw life leaving eyes, but the body did not recognize death, continuing to move by inertia, programmed by poison or madness for the last movement. Mothers looked at their children twitching on the floor and could not approach, because the fear of infection was stronger than love. Husbands looked at wives and saw in them not loved ones but mechanisms broken on the go. In this holy place there was no hope, there was only waiting for the end, which dragged on, becoming agonizing and endless. The music that had accompanied the dancers for weeks finally fell silent. The drums were removed, the flutes and violins fell silent, the musicians received their pay and left the city, taking with them memories that did not let them sleep at night. The silence that descended upon the city was heavier than any sound. It seemed as if the very air had frozen in anticipation of something that never happened. The survivors, numbering several dozen people, slowly came to their senses, not remembering what had happened to them. They looked at their bloody legs, at bruises and wounds, and did not understand how they had ended up here. Their minds had erased these weeks like a protective mechanism, shielding the psyche from complete destruction. But the bodies remembered. Scars remained forever, as a reminder that flesh can be treacherous, that legs can carry a person against their will, that rhythm can be stronger than reason. City authorities began hastily covering their tracks. The bodies of the dead were buried in mass graves outside the city, without funeral rites or any ceremonies, so as not to attract unnecessary attention and not sow panic. Pits were dug deep so that the smell would not reach residential quarters, so that the earth would quicker hide evidence of the council's incompetence. The square was washed and cleaned of bloodstains, the platforms were dismantled and burned, the ash was scattered to the wind so that nothing would remind anyone of those days. The musicians received generous payment for silence and left Strasbourg, taking with them a secret that they would take to the grave. Streets filled with people again, trade resumed, life returned to its course, but something had changed forever. People's gazes became more cautious, steps quieter, as if everyone was afraid that if they stumbled into a rhythm, the madness would return. Official chronicles of that time contain only scant mentions of the strange disease that affected the townspeople. Details were carefully hidden, documents were destroyed or rewritten. Those who tried to speak the truth were subjected to persecution and accusations of heresy. Fear of the consequences of truth was stronger than the desire to restore justice. Owners of grain warehouses continued their activities, their wealth grew, and their influence strengthened, because they knew that silence was worth more than gold. The church returned to its affairs, bells rang again, but now there was a note of sadness in their ringing, as if they were mourning those who found no salvation in the chapel of St. Vitus. The city survived, but it became different. It learned to live with a secret that could not be spoken aloud, with a truth that was too dangerous to be known. And in this silence that came after the storm, a new legend was born. People said that St. Vitus heard the prayers, but the price turned out to be too high. Others whispered that demons simply got full and left on their own will. But there were those who looked at the barns, at the sacks of grain, at the bread on the tables and remained silent. They knew that the devil does not always come with horns and a tail, sometimes he comes in the form of black mold on ears of rye, in the form of hunger, in the form of indifference of those who should protect. Silence hung over the city heavier than lead, pressing on the shoulders of residents, reminding them every second that the truth was buried together with the dancers. And while the city slept, recovering strength after the nightmare, somewhere deep in the earth, in damp barns, ergot continued to bloom, waiting for the next hungry year, the next moment of weakness, the next chance to make people dance to death again. But this was already a story for future generations, and for now Strasbourg was licking its wounds, pretending that nothing had happened, that this was only a temporary clouding of reason, and not a systemic error that cost hundreds of lives. The music fell silent, but the echo remained, and every step on the pavement resonated in the memory of those who survived, a reminder of how thin the line is between life and death, between dance and convulsion, between a human and a puppet in the hands of invisible forces. The history officially concluded with a statement from the city council regarding a mass religious frenzy caused by the unfavorable arrangement of planets and the moral decay of the population. This version was the only one permissible for public discussion, and any dissent was brutally suppressed, while the voices of those who dared to whisper about poisoned grain quickly fell silent in dungeons or disappeared forever along with their owners. In the spacious hall of the town hall, where the fate of hundreds of people had been decided only recently, an atmosphere of relief now reigned, mixed with cold calculation. The magistrates sat behind heavy oak tables, their faces calm, their hands steady as they placed seals on documents that forever changed truth into a convenient lie. The candles burned evenly, without smoking, as if the fire itself was afraid to stain this sacred procedure of lying for the sake of order. Scribes wrote letters in neat handwriting, dipping quills into ink that was meant to cement the official version of events for future generations. Not a word about ergot, not a word about the greed of merchants, not a word about the inaction of doctors. Only God's punishment, only the sins of the people, only the will of heaven that could not be challenged. All documents regarding grain purchases, warehouse books, and inspector reports were destroyed by personal order of the magistrate that same night. A large iron chest was carried out into the inner courtyard of the town hall, where a bonfire was already blazing, prepared specifically for this purpose. The papers burned brightly, flaring up with orange tongues of flame that illuminated the faces of the people standing around with an ominous light. This was not just fire, this was purification, a ritual burning of evidence of guilt. Ash swirled in the air, settling on the stones of the courtyard, on the clothes of the officials, on their consciences, if they still had any left. The wind caught the light burnt scraps, on which one could still make out figures of supply volumes, names of suppliers, dates of flour batches, and carried them into the darkness of the night Strasbourg. One of the servants later said that he saw how the ash fell on the roofs of houses exactly like snow, white and cold, covering the city with a shroud of oblivion. The city authorities preferred to attribute hundreds of deaths to God's punishment rather than admit their negligence and the poisoning of the population, because admitting guilt would mean the collapse of the entire management system. Trust was a currency more valuable than the lives of the poor, and the treasury had to remain full, even if it meant filling it with blood. Grain merchants who knew about the rye affected by ergot continued their activities, their wealth grew, and their influence strengthened. They built new barns, drier and better ventilated, but not because they cared about the health of the citizens, but to preserve the marketable appearance of the grain. No one was punished for this tragedy, no one answered for broken fates and ruined lives. The priests returned to their duties, the bells rang again, announcing Sunday services, but now there was some falsity in their ringing, as if the metal remembered the silence that had lasted too long. The surviving dancers, those few dozen people who managed to come to their senses, were scattered around the city, many moved away from Strasbourg, unable to live where the earth remembered every step they took. They tried not to talk about what happened, fearing that words could start the mechanism of the disease again. They hid their mutilated legs under long skirts and trousers, limped in silence, avoided music and rhythmic sounds. Their children grew up with a ban on dancing, with the understanding that movement could be deadly, that rhythm could kill. Walking today through the same streets of Strasbourg, one can notice that the rhythm of the cobblestone seems to repeat the steps of those unfortunate people, and it seems that the music is still playing somewhere underground. The modern city shines with the lights of shop windows, noises with tourist crowds, smells of coffee and fresh pastries, but worth turning into a narrow alley where the old cobblestones have been preserved, and time seems to compress. The stone remembers everything, every strike of feet, every drop of blood, every death cry. Tourists walk on these slabs, take photos, laugh, not suspecting that under their soles lies a giant grave. They do not hear the echo because the noise of modernity drowns out the whisper of history, but if you listen in the silence of early morning, when the city is still sleeping, you can catch a strange hum. Local residents whisper that on certain nights, when the moon is especially bright, one can hear echoes of that music, sounds of drums and flutes coming from underground. Some say that shadows on the walls of old houses sometimes move not as they should, repeating strange, jerky movements, as if someone invisible continues their eternal dance in a dimension inaccessible to the eye. The truth about the Strasbourg dancing plague was buried together with its victims, leaving behind only questions that were never answered. How many more lives can be sacrificed to preserve the tranquility of those in power? How much truth can be hidden behind the facade of official versions? History teaches us that silence is sometimes louder than any words, and the indifference of those who should protect becomes the most terrible weapon. In the year 1518 it was grain and greed, in other times it was other reasons, but the essence remained unchanged. The system always strives for self-preservation, and the price of this preservation is often measured in human lives. We read history textbooks, believe dates and facts, but rarely ask ourselves who wrote these lines and why. We accept the official version because it is easier, because doubt requires effort, and the truth is often uncomfortable and scary. The epidemic of the year 1518 became not just a medical anomaly but a symbol of how easily truth can be manipulated when power and money are at stake. The dancers whose bodies moved to the rhythm of death became involuntary victims of a system that placed its interests above human lives. Their mad dance was not just an illness, it was a cry of despair that was never heard. They were pawns in a big game where pieces changed but the rules remained the same. The strong protect their own, the weak pay the price. And this lesson is relevant not only for medieval Strasbourg but also for our time, when news is filtered, facts are hidden, and convenient lies spread faster than truth. We live in a world where information is available, but truth is often hidden behind layers of interpretations, censorship, and fear. And today, centuries later, we must remember those who danced to death in the squares of Strasbourg. Their history warns us against blind trust in official versions, against silent consent to injustice. Truth may be hidden, but it never disappears completely, waiting for the moment when someone dares to ask uncomfortable questions and demand answers. The ash from the burned documents has long scattered, the names of officials are forgotten, the wealth of merchants has disappeared, but the memory of 400 bodies convulsing on the hot cobblestones remains. It lives in the stones, in the wind, in the silence between the notes of any music. This is a reminder that human life is fragile, that mind can be deceived, that body can become a prison, and power can be merciless. We walk on the earth not knowing what is hidden under our feet, not knowing what secrets the cities we live in keep. Strasbourg remembers. And as long as it remembers, as long as there are those who are ready to listen to the whisper of history, the truth will not die completely. It will wait, hiding in the shadow of old buildings, in the patterns of cobblestones, in the silence of night streets, waiting for the moment when we finally understand that the price of silence is too high to pay it again. The music fell silent, but the echo remained, and every step on the pavement resonated in the memory of those who survived, a reminder of how thin the line is between life and death, between dance and convulsion, between a human and a puppet in the hands of invisible forces. And the question of how many more lives can be sacrificed for the sake of tranquility remains hanging in the air, heavy and unresolved, like that smell of pus and sweat that once filled the streets of this city.